We'll wrap up in time to get everyone get to the noon session.
Exactly. Okay, so I see. So we have till noon, right? Okay. Well, without further ado, please, gentlemen.
All right. Thank you, George. Good morning. I appreciate folks staying to the very end of the conference here. And it's also my pleasure today. You know, one of the best things that's ever happened to me when I've traveled is, you know, you're boarding the plane and you're walking up in line and you actually get there in the ticket and they say, oh, I'm sorry, we've got a different seat for you, right? And they hand you a seat and you look at it and you see that nice low number and realize you've just gotten an upgrade. Hasn't happened to me in a number of years, but it's the most delightful thing ever. And I'm happy to say those of you who looked at the agenda closely only noticed my name, but you get an upgrade today with the addition of my colleague, Mike Korn. So Mike is the Chief Information Security Officer here at UC San Diego. And he and I gave a variant of this talk at Global Summit a couple weeks ago, and he had a very nice introduction then. And so I asked him if he'd be willing to wander down the street here and do that again, and he was gracious enough to come down. So with that, I'm actually going to turn the reins over to Mike first to give his introduction, and then I'll circle back.
Thank you, Vaughn. Feel free to interrupt if you got a question to come up or you'd like to ask. I included this slide originally because at I2 we have some positions open and I wanted to encourage people to go to jobs.ucsd.edu and apply. This could be your view. It's a little cloudy today, but this is where we're at. But what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about what it looks like when you're a CISO at a typical R1 and you're trying to figure out how to support sponsored programs and research projects. It's a challenge, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the dimensions of that. This slide gives you just sort of a picture of what I face at UCSD. Again, we're pretty typical large R1, little over $1 billion in sponsored projects. You can see the quantity of proposals, and we're pretty successful, so we have thousands of these grants coming in. If you look at just our DoD funding, you can see, what do I have on here? Over 400 DoD-related grants. Now that money is spread out across the campus. We have a health system as well. They bring in a lot of money, but you can see a lot of it's located in 1 or 2 units. But for me, the challenge of this is one of scale. So if you look at my resources, and again, I think I have a fairly typical higher ed security shop, a little on the small side. This doesn't include the identity management group, just the core security team. There's really 12, 13 of us. And that works out to a little over 33 DoD grants per person if we were going to divide those up. And this is not really sustainable. It's hard for me to take, you know, like any other security shop, I've got people that are specialists in incident response. I've got security engineers that help you engineer systems. We have people that run our vulnerability management program. I actually can't use most of these resources out to work with researchers. They just don't have that skill set, and there's just too few of them compared to their operational duties. So what I do is I also then look at what other resources do I have on a campus like this. We're fortunate that we have 3 full-time research facilitators. These people work in research IT, and they run around and they help faculty get access to IT resources. Sometimes that's helping them take advantage of central resources. Sometimes it's helping them get access to cloud resources or national resources, Open Science Grid, things like that. We're fortunate here at San Diego that we have a supercomputing center. SDSC has a great security team, and they're security professionals, which is what I like. So really, we work together closely, but the people they work with, they take care of. I don't really have to do very much about it. We have a health system. They have an InfoSec shop, woefully undersized, in my opinion, for the size of our health system. But the same thing, it's a group of security professionals. I don't really have to deal with the stuff they take responsibility for. We partner closely with Export Control, the Research Compliance Office, and Grants and Contracts, because they're the people that are telling us where the plutonium is on campus. And I don't mean real plutonium, but I mean that export control data, I mean the CUI data, the classified research. They're the folks that help us identify that and look at the grants and track that. And I have a spreadsheet, a little over 1,000 grants currently on campus from the DoD. So I have trouble figuring out exactly how I'm going to handle this. And really, for me, what it amounts to is I need techniques that scale. The challenge here is that how do we do this in our normal sort of workaday enterprise security operations? You buy a tool, antivirus software, anti-malware software, and you make everyone run it. Or you buy an IDS and you put it on your network and you watch the entire network. That works fine to a degree, but as we all know, research projects are different. They're custom-built cars. They're all Rube Goldberg devices. So, you know, when I look and try to compare and contrast what I do for ordinary enterprise security, you know, if you look at it, sort of the classic CISSP model, it says inventory your environment, write your policies, and go enforce controls. Well, that works fine for my HR department. That works fine for us in central IT. But you know what it's like to work with faculty who feel policy is an opt-in situation? It's a wholly different cup of tea. So what I believe needs to happen on the research side is we need to have a better understanding of the scientific workflow. And I don't just mean sort of how the instrumentation works. I mean, we need to understand how the grant writing process is. Where are the opportunities for the researchers to work with you? Most of the time when I get a out of the blue call from a researcher saying, I need this security section in my grant proposal, it's due tomorrow. I mean, you know this. So there's that. We also need to deal with certain issues on the research side that are very different than they are on the enterprise side. I think Vaughn will talk about some of this a little bit later. My favorite one to pick on is reproducibility. So we go to units all the time. We do this day in and day out, patch your systems. We found these vulnerabilities. If I go to many research projects, they're like, I can't patch the system because it's collecting data for 6 months at a time. Or it's an embedded system. Or a patch might affect the reproducibility of the data coming out of the system. So I have to take patch management off the table for many of these environments. So basically what I think on the research side, what we need to do is really embrace that culture. We need to understand how faculty, you know, how their research projects work, what security means in that culture. We need to stop fighting it. We need to recognize that's the way we operate. And that really takes the ability to talk to faculty. Now, I don't think I know anyone here personally, but I can tell you I know lots of security people who are real happy sitting in a cubicle with their hands playing on a keyboard, playing with their intrusion detection system, or doing network forensics, or endpoint forensics. But to sit in a lab with someone who's a member of the National Academies of Science and talk about security, that's a skill that many of us in, I think, security don't have. So when I step back from this and I look at what do I need as a CISO, I need a better understanding of what sponsored research projects are operationally. I need to understand that whole life cycle. I also need tools that are more tuned for those kinds of projects. Again, many of the standard software tools that I have in my quiver as an enterprise security person aren't going to work in a research environment. We have a tool many of you use, it runs on endpoints to identify PII. Lots of these research projects have very confidential and sensitive data, but no PII. So basically, I need a more flexible toolkit. I need a better understanding of what the state of the art is in these research environments. So can you talk about science DMZs if you're a security professional? Do you understand how to secure one? Do you know how to enable access to things like Open Science Grid and how you secure that kind of access? There's a whole portfolio of tools in the research world that many of us in enterprise security have no idea they exist. We need risk assessments. I talked a little bit about PII not being in these projects. A lot of the risk assessments that we typically use are based around PII or privacy exposures. Do they really focus on accessibility or data integrity? Not many of them do. And so we really need flexible risk assessment methodologies that address this kind of special flavor of research. And I think these last three are really critical. You need staff that know how to work with a researcher. You need reusable templates, going back to my scale problem. I can't, even if I had 25 new people dedicated to research support, they could not in a year go through and meet with all the researchers at UCSD and talk about their projects in any meaningful way. So I need templates, I need scalable tools. And I think the other big difference with research as compared to enterprise security is this notion that you need to see in the dark. And so I'll tell you my joke. A lady comes home from work and she sees her next door neighbor out under the streetlight wandering around looking for something. And she says to him, what are you doing out here? And he says, I lost my keys. She goes, you lost your keys under my streetlight? He goes, no, but that's where the light is. And the reason I think this is important is I think the tools we have to protect my HR system, my finance system, our PCI systems are probably good enough if we apply them. You know, the intrusion detection systems, the IPSs, the firewalls, the endpoint security stuff. When you're talking about research environments, at least here, and this is true, I think every place I've worked, the people that are after those environments work in the dark. Those tools are useless. No, not useless, but they're not at the tip of the spear. When we are dealing with APT attacks against some of our units, they're not coming in through firewalls. They're not coming in putting malware on every website. They're going after accounts buried deep in the unit so they can pivot. So that's a real problem for us. I did want to mention there's other areas of support. And again, Vaughn will talk about some of these. I am a co-chair of the HISC, the EDUCAUSE program, and there are resources there that people can dive into. If they're not familiar with them, I really encourage you to. The Security Professionals Conference is coming up in May in Chicago. It's a great place. I think we had 500-600 people there last year. I think we're expecting about 700 this year. So you're in a nice, modest-sized conference with 800 security professionals. Many of them have your jobs. So it's a good place to share. Vaughn's organization, Trusted CI, of course, has a lot of material online and sponsors some webinars and talks. And then, of course, if you do, especially if you do big science, although I think even if you do little science, little size science, there is the National Science Foundation Cybersecurity Summit, which Vaughn runs that. I've been on the program committee for years, and it's usually in DC, but if you like San Diego, we're hosting it here this year in October. So that's, again, a very interesting environment where you get to sit in the room with people that are running big experiments like LIGO, like IceCube, like the research equipment at the South Pole, and you get to hear how they're approaching cybersecurity and IT infrastructure in general. It's very interesting. I think this crowd probably knows this, but I'll just put it up here as well. NSF does have a couple of programs that you should be aware of if you're not aware of them. These do provide resources for cyber infrastructure and help address security. And in my experience, it's interesting to watch the solicitations as they come out. But having been on some of the submission review panels, I can tell you there are all sorts of people applying for grants to do very interesting things that most institutions could take on if they really wanted to. You sort of have to learn how to do this, but there's a lot of value in watching this, and you're leaving money on the table if you're not trying to participate in these programs. Let me tell you a little story that I think illustrates this problem that I'm dealing with. I want to go back to this notion of, are our staffs prepared to support research? So when I got here, I got a phone call from faculty members said, we're building this system and it's going to hold some sort of data. I can't remember what it was. And I think we need you guys to come in and help us make sure it's secure. Okay. So we go there, and I bring my right-hand man, who's now left, so I can tell this story. He was very excited. He had never met with a researcher about a security problem like this before. And so he had prepared, and he whipped out this piece of paper when we meet with the faculty member and goes, here's the campus network minimum security standards. Go meet them. That was the gambit that he opened with. And this, of course, went nowhere. And this is not a way to talk to researchers. He was asking for help. We didn't even understand what his problem was yet. And we were giving him the policy solution. So in an attempt to try to deal with this, and this is something Vaughn will talk a little bit about later, we saw that there was a huge need for classic enterprise security professionals to learn how to support and work with researchers better. I don't have an easy answer for the scale problem, but part of it is to make sure the resources you do have in your offices understand how research works. So what we're doing, the ResearchSOC is a program, again, Vaughn will talk about this at a little more length, but we're putting together a series of annual workshops. We're doing the first sort of pilot workshop at EDUCAUSE in May, half-day workshop. And then every year we will have at least one, probably 3-day on-prem workshop here at San Diego, although we may take some of those on the road too, to try to train CISOs, security architects, leaders in your shops on what security means in the sponsored research domain. So let me give you an example of, here's sort of just an overview of what we're doing, but an idea of what the sample curriculum might look like. So on the first day, we'll talk about everything you need to know about sponsored projects, how they work, what the grant process is like, what it means for the researcher. We will then put time into some training around what facilitation means. How do you sit down and talk to people? We're going to do some scenarios where you actually practice this in small groups. This is where working with the research facilitation people are good because they do this day in and day out. And again, we in security tend not to be very good at this. So it's a chance to learn how to talk, really how to listen to researchers. Then what we're going to do on day 2 or 3 is some tabletop planning around security plans for research projects. And the goal here is to get a couple of PIs in and literally run a facilitation exercise with them individually, develop a plan on the spot as an exercise. So you walk out of there having done this. And then on the course at the end of the workshop, we will review and develop some artifacts. And I think that's about all I had to say, unless there was some questions. If not, I can turn it over to Vaughn. Did I go through that right on time?
So thank you, Mike. Tongue in cheek, I now have come from the other perspective. So here's the view through the researcher's window dealing with cybersecurity. You note the bars, a little bit of sunlight filtering through, but I just, so I'm coming at this from a different perspective. As Mike mentioned, I am honored to be the director of a couple projects funded by the National Science Foundation to help with cybersecurity for scientific research, right? Just a little context of that, Mike gave some scales at UCSD. From the perspective of NSF, it funds over 11,000 projects a year, over $7 billion worth of research. And most of that research is at institutions like UCSD and like yours. And so, and it tends to be, as Mike described Rube Goldberg. I may not use that in the room with the scientists, but it tends to be very individualized and unique. So it's a big challenge, particularly in the aggregate, to get started with, particularly with IT professionals and security professionals that already have a lot of other things on their plate. So the short version is I'm here to help with that. I'm here to help the researchers get their research done in a trustworthy manner. And I'm going to talk a little bit here, shifting the perspective. Why do they care about that? Then what my center, what resources it has to help both sides of that discussion. And then a little bit I'll broach, Mike mentioned the ResearchSOC, and I'll talk a little bit about that second project, which is spun up and is focusing a little bit more on the InfoSec side of things. So first I want to talk a little bit just about the terminology. I use the term open science, and there's a certain amount of ambiguity of that, but let me just contrast that. We have a fair amount of research out there that's using regulated data. HIPAA, CUI, for those of you familiar with that, things that have sort of clear dictated compliance programs that go with it. For better or for worse, in some sense, that sort of research is a little bit more clear. There's check boxes to check for it, and you're good. Then there's a whole bunch of other science, which is what NSF science predominantly is, that doesn't deal with regulated data in this way. Think about things like astronomy. Think about climate science, which is of growing interest. Think about the physics, the geology. So this is all science that's out there. There's not a NIST or other cybersecurity standard you pull down and say, here's how you secure it. And for a lot of campuses, or for almost any campus, if you set aside the medical school, this is the majority of the research that goes on their campus. So this is most of what somebody in Mike's shoes or another IT professional. So in this talk, I'm really going to focus on that open science as sort of more of the great unknown. And let me start with the first myth that's out there. There's a real strong desire to equate confidentiality with cybersecurity. And this is understandable. If you read in the paper, what do we see all the time in terms of cybersecurity? It's breaches. It's the exposure of private data being, the confidentiality of it breached. So this tends to get drilled into our head a little bit. And you see this a lot with researchers. You ask them, oh, what are your cybersecurity needs? Oh, my data is all public, so I don't have any cybersecurity needs. And I'm going to talk through a little bit why that's off base and a mistaken assumption. If you talk to almost any researcher and you ask them, well, do you care about having your results be trusted, be reproducible? They're almost certainly going to say yes. And if you start distilling that down to what that means at the IT layer, this is a pretty strong reliance on data integrity. So we talk about integrity of the processes, but at some point at the IT infrastructure, we just need to know no one's messed with their data. And this can be anything from, a malicious entity getting in and just messing with it. And also, I will open now, we've got things like ransomware that have come along, which is basically a data integrity attack, right? You encrypt the data and you hold it for ransom. For those of you who aren't familiar with this particular piece of malware, it's really insidious because before, criminals used to need to steal data that was of value to them, social security numbers, credit card numbers. Now they figured out, well, instead they'll take the data that's of value to you and encrypt it and then sell it back to you, right? It's really insidious because it changes the economics of the situation. All that matters now is that you care about the data. They don't have to care about the data at all. So it's sort of an insidious attack. So they've got to have, so now things such as integrity of the data, both on the minor and the macro scale, are really important. Reproducibility is really important. And Mike mentioned, the tension here around patching, right? We need to patch their systems. They oftentimes, trust me, there are systems running decades old operating systems sitting in the middle of some of these big scientific projects, and they're just loath to touch them. So from the information security side, we need to recognize and figure out ways of dealing with that tension rather than just insisting on the patching. And there are systems, they're very isolated off in different interesting ways. We talk about that. There's also the very sort of basic problem here that if a system's been hacked, the scientific research on that system, you naturally have to wonder, what did they do? Yeah, we don't expect a lot of hackers to be interested in modifying scientific data, but the internet has shown what miscreants will do can be a little bit hard for us to predict. And particularly with some of these more politically charged areas of science now, this is a big concern to some of us. Scientific productivity is another key one. A lot of science fields are involved with events that maybe aren't predictable. This particular story here is actually from an astronomy group down in Western Australia that had a really close call being able to miss doing some key astronomy because, unrelated stupid cyber attack on the system controlling the telescope. So there are real availability issues around science that even do nothing but open data. A key challenge that we tend to see is, Mike mentioned a little bit the research process. The research process tends to have this culture of urgency. I'll tell you, there's a lot of, having done a lot of grant proposals myself, there's a lot of hurry up and wait. There's a big rush to get a proposal in before the deadline. Then you kind of forget about it for a while and sit. Then all of a sudden you get the news that your grant's being funded. And next thing you know, you've got to get a collaboration up and running and productive as fast as possible because you're now facing a 3 or 5 year proposal deadline, grant project deadline, and you've got to have publications done and students. So there's always this sort of constant stream of rush that's a little bit at odds with sort of the culture of, we've got institutions of higher education that have been around for decades, if not centuries. And so a change here. And so we need to be able to support these projects having, and oftentimes there's some security in that collaboration. If nothing else, we've got students involved. We need to share data. We need to control who writes the data, even if we don't care who reads it. So this is a push. And Mike touched upon this issue. We talk about cyber infrastructure, which is a sort of an NSF buzzword for research computing, so to speak. And it tends to be more diverse than our enterprise infrastructure. We deal with this a lot. We've got everything from telescopes that have, command and control systems involved, sensors underneath the ice in the Antarctic going over satellites. We've got huge data sets, high performance, everything as I call it, right? You stick an HP in front of network, storage, blah, blah, blah. All this stuff that's sort of different than what's in the standard enterprise shops that we're used to. And it all needs to sort of meet these availability, these integrity, even with the open science, and support this whole sort of collaboration. So this is another challenge that goes on in the research space that demands some flexibility. Finally, a little bit of a higher point, and we're starting to see some of this play out politically. And I put it bluntly sort of like this. If we don't look like we've got our act together, someone will come in and tell us how to do what we're doing. And this scares the bejesus out of me somewhat even more than, the bad things that may happen to us from the bad guys. So we need to not only sort of, be doing this, but be able to demonstratively show that we're, securing this research in a way that takes some of our national priorities and scientific priorities at stake. Lastly, what I have found is even in the open science projects, they tend to have some confidentiality needs. They're just not front and center. A real common one is some period where they've got embargoed data or they've got pre-publication. If you think about when LIGO discovered the gravity waves, they had all sorts of rumors flying around. So even in these open projects, there tend to be little periods where they're kind of just getting their act together before putting something out there, be it just data, and they want to make sure it's sanitized, to getting announcements put out there in a controlled way. So even these open projects tend to have some confidentiality needs. Mike alluded to the fact that there's often research data out there that doesn't fall under this regulated PII. A great example of this, this is some work by Dr. Tanya Wolfberger at Illinois Chicago. She works with endangered species, identifying, cataloging them. Very worried about this information falling into the hands of poachers and other issues. So here is data that's got great ethical concerns with it, but doesn't fall into any sort of our standard regulated data regime. So asking sort of the right questions about, sort of what keeps the principal investigator up at night can be really important instead of coming at this from what's, important from standard enterprise stuff. So now hopefully I've given you a little bit of context and, why I'm doing this. I want to tell you now, shift gears and talk a little bit about what I can do to help those that are involved in tackling some of these challenges. So as Mike mentioned, I've got the honor of running, it's a center, we call it Trusted CI, Trusted Cyber Infrastructure. It's funded by the NSF as their cybersecurity center of excellence. So we're here to help the community of researchers and those supporting researchers, including research community, IT pros. We're now in our 7th year, so we've been serving the community for a while. It's a distributed organization. You know, I'm leading it from Indiana University, but we've now got partners throughout the United States that are contributing. And we've worked with nearly, I suspect we're over 200 NSF projects at this point having impact. And then through our various things had impact on, you know, hundreds of other projects through the summit that Mike mentioned in our webinar. So one of the things that we do, our most in-depth way of engaging with projects is something we call an engagement. And an engagement is basically us spending, it's typically 6 months, but it can vary depending upon the project's needs, working hand in hand with a project collaboratively to tackle some cybersecurity challenge they have. And this can range everything on one end of the spectrum. It's very common for us to have a project that comes to us and say, we're nervous about cybersecurity, but we have no idea where to start. I mean, this is, you know, we've sort of learned to read this between the lines of some of the applications that we get. Everything to more advanced projects that have a specific piece of software they want us to review, or a specific architectural change, or they want us to come in, you know, we think we have things kind of go together, but we'd like another set of eyes on it. Everything they get. So we do this collaboratively with projects. We do it flexibly. We do it privately, publicly, to whatever degree they're comfortable with. You know, we like to have more results that we can share with the community, but we understand some projects are reticent about that. So we work really with whatever we can do. We take applications. We have what we call an engagement application period every 6 months. We happen to be open right now with a deadline of April 3rd. It's not a very heavyweight application. It's a Google form. There's a few fields we want to know. You know, how is this project impacting science? Please let us know about any ties it has to NSF. To answer a frequent question, no, it's okay if it's not an NSF project. We will consider non-NSF projects in this. But trust me, you've got 2 weeks left on this engagement application period, which is enough time to fill out an application. So if you've got a project out there you think that could benefit with us, feel free to talk to me. Feel free to wade in and write an application for that. And as you can see, this map up here is the applications we've had so far, and they've been spanned all across the US, and the little box in the corner, you know, we've even worked with IceCube, who's both at Wisconsin down in Antarctica, and also Gemini, which is in Chile. So we've now done a good part of the Western hemisphere, and also done some collaborations with Europe and the other continents. We also endeavor to put a good amount of guidance up on our website, everything from identity and access management to a step-by-step, easy-to-follow guide for writing a cybersecurity program, to the risk profile. And we make these all freely available on the trustedci.org website. So even if you're looking for something that's not a heavyweight engagement, you just need a manual, we've had a number of projects just pick up our guidance and walk through it. Mike mentioned the NSF Cybersecurity Summit. We're really excited to be coming back to San Diego. That'll be mid-October, the 15th through the 17th. The URL is up there, basically trustedci.org/summit. Welcome folks from the area here. You know, we're intentionally moving it out of DC to get it out into the rest of the US, and hopefully pick up some folks who haven't been able to travel to DC for this. And as Mike said, it's just a great venue for connecting with other people who are tackling these challenges around trustworthy research, to hear what they're doing and make good contacts. A little bit bigger picture, we've got a 5-year plan that we're working towards. So if you want to see kind of, where our goalposts are and to give us feedback on that, we welcome that. And this document's also up on our website. And we also do a biannual survey of the community. We like to try to figure out, are we having an impact? And this is a very nascent community. We've had about 20 folks respond to the last one, but we'd like, particularly look for this from us. We'd like to hear from as many projects as possible so we can start building up good, broad, longitudinal data on where we're at. The results are all confidential once they get in there. We aggregate them all together, but we're just trying to start getting a state of where we're at in terms of cybersecurity and research. Just to tease you, because the deadline for this was last week, but we're starting to have a set of fellows now. So this is folks from around the country who will get special training and access to us. The idea is that they will help us liaise with different communities. We're going to do this every year. So you can look for it again next year, and we'll have an announcement here in the next month or so about our inaugural cohort on this, but I'm really excited about this. We're going to have 6 fellows in that cohort, and we had well over 20 applications. So it's been a good competitive process with a lot of interest. Another aspect we're doing, shifting to a different sort of researcher now. The National Science Foundation, as well as DHS, DOE, funds a lot of cybersecurity research. And we don't see enough of that research moving sort of out of the research phase. So one of the roles that we're taking is to help connect those cybersecurity researchers with practitioners like my colleague Mike here and others around the country to try to help figure out where some of the unmet needs of the folks like Mike and his peers could be met by that research. And so we're hosting a workshop in Chicago in June, and be interested on both researchers and practitioners who want to participate in that matchmaking process and help us guide that. And so this is another program that's relatively new that we're just starting up. Big picture, one of the things I mentioned earlier, if we would like us as a community to have our act together around cybersecurity for open research in a demonstrable way, we're starting to work on a cybersecurity program. We're calling this the Trusted CI Framework, which would be something that could sit alongside something like a NIST CUI or RMF or CSF framework and be seen as suitable both within our community to CISOs as an acceptable cybersecurity framework, and then hopefully eventually to even those outside our community. In other words, we could have something that could stand up to an auditor or somebody from outside or in the contract terms. I see this as just a necessary thing. If we don't control sort of our own cybersecurity destiny in this space, someone else will step in and control it for us. And I think that would just be really detrimental to both actually the security of science and its productivity, because I don't think anyone really understands the research as well as our community does, and we need to take ownership of that. I'll mention we're doing some work here. We have an open science risk profile. This is a document that I wrote, Trusted CI and ESNet wrote several years together, and it basically is meant to be a Rosetta Stone of sorts for translating risks between a scientist and an InfoSec professional. And it basically gives you a process of walking through, I've got this weird scientific instrument, but I've never done any sort of risk assessment before. And you've got another person sitting in the room next to you who's a risk professional who understands enterprise IT. How do you sort of work the two together to having a nomenclature about this scientific instrument? And so it's a process on that front. We're going to keep expanding it. It's going to become part of the framework. We're going to strengthen it in different areas that you see up here around data integrity, the confidentiality, and start trying to add some mitigations to it to strengthen it. A number of other services that I haven't mentioned that we add. You can find all of these on the trustedci.org website, and I'll just provide the links here in my slides, which CENIC will have and distribute, and you can, and help yourself to any of those or contact me if you're looking for something. The last bit I just wanted to mention, Mike mentioned the ResearchSOC. So if you're confused at this point between Trusted CI and the ResearchSOC, that's good because you're paying attention probably. So these are two different projects that have been funded by NSF. So the ResearchSOC is a relative newcomer starting late last year. So these two different centers have different foci. So as you've probably gleaned now from my talk so far, the Trusted CI is really here to help you programmatically. Understand how to manage your risks, how to create a cybersecurity program, policies, procedures, sort of that intellectual property around cybersecurity and research. ResearchSOC is very much focused on bits and bytes. It's going to be standing up a security operations center or SOC-like services for research projects. So how do you do vulnerability detection for research projects? How do you do alerting? So flowing bits and bytes over to the wire. It's building upon some operational services that are already in place at IU, the OmniSOC, Duke Stinger service, the Vulnerability Identification Center from PSC/3 Rocks. It's also doing a strong outreach component, the workshop that Mike talked about, to the InfoSec professionals, and really trying to help them, build across scale. Mike talked about scale. We're also looking for scale here. How do we do workshops across the country to work with the InfoSec professionals to build that understanding of how to relate with researchers? So with that, I would just like to thank the National Science Foundation, thank Mike for joining me, CENIC for having me out for this talk, and all of you for your attention. And with that, both Mike and I are happy to take any questions or comments.
Well, okay, making sure you can hear me. So, sorry about the coughing, trying to get rid of it. My question for you, Vaughn, sorry. Actually, this one goes to Mike. So, in regards to the systems that you're unable to patch, what are you doing to be able to mitigate the risk factors? I presume that they're blocked completely from the net and whatnot, but there's got to be more.
There's limits of what you can do. It depends on what the instrument needs to do. I mean, historically, I've relied on network isolation as the best way to deal with that. The challenge is you're running an MRI on this part of campus. It's got to send medical information to a hospital across town. And sometimes all you can do is lock it down as far as you can get it, isolate as much as you can, and make sure you have adequate monitoring in place.
Have you observed instances where they've been owned fairly easily, or?
Not once we've sort of sat down and looked at it. Sometimes we discover them because they get owned. Because a lot of these pieces of equipment are running Windows XP or Windows NT, and you can't go to someone and say, you can't interrupt the science. And so you can't go to someone and say, that $1 million MRI has got to be replaced. You just can't do that. So
gotcha. So reimage and hope for the best, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Questions, folks?
Hey, Carl Cornell, Stanford Research Computing. So a chunk of my time is actually dedicated to specific clients instead of more generic stuff. And kind of following on that, like, you can't go to a researcher and say this MRI isn't safe anymore or secure anymore, so you have to get rid of it, just throw it away. What efforts are being made to work with, for example, DNA sequencer companies to say, hey, you're still running Windows embedded on your sequencers or Windows 7 or something like that. What are your plans for moving to Windows 10? Is there any kind of collaboration in terms of not exerting pressure, but you know what I mean?
It's a good question. And the short answer is I'm not aware of anything particularly organized. I don't yet have, because we would have to figure out, I'm going to think out loud here. So if this sounds a little bit like thinking out loud, that's why. I think we've got to figure out how we would apply our limited resources there across all the different science disciplines, right? Could we identify a small enough number of companies or the right commercial organizations or whatever to go do that, and then give them a strong enough story to fight the economics of that situation, right? I mean, the reason why they're using sort of the standard COTS Windows XP is because it's just cheap. And the reason why they haven't upgraded is not because they don't care, but it's just they don't have a strong enough story to fight that. So short answer to your question, I think that's an interesting idea. I would have to sort of work through, where do we think we could have enough influence to be able to do that in order to make it a viable path to pursue.
There's two other pieces to this. Part of the economics that I think is challenging to deal with is many of these instruments are so expensive. I'm thinking of, we run a fleet of ships here, and those are measured in basically days at sea. And when they're not at sea and there's a technical upgrade or something needs to take place, that's costing serious change, just not being used. So I'm not positive how you deal with that. But, I'll take a harder stance on this. I think this just screams for regulation. I mean, I think until the government wakes up and says, you don't get to, on the medical side, I think that's starting to happen. Medical devices tend to be more regulated. But the notion that cybersecurity is part of your business model or not is just wrong. I know nothing's going to happen there, but that's what I'd love to see happen.
I'll put the seed here for a good debate that we can have at a later date. Fundamentally, the challenge here is we have a difference between our procurement cycles and our IT life cycles. And DoD has this. I mean, you mentioned ships, right? I mean, their model is, every 20 years you upgrade the ship. Microsoft's model is every 7 years you depreciate an OS. And there's just a fundamental challenge there. And I see this as only getting worse with our IoT devices. Right? I mean, they're getting, these $10 things we're buying off of Amazon and then installing. There's just no way they're going to be all of them are going to be supported 5 years from now. So we've got a fundamental issue of refresh there that we have to deal with, and agility. So, you're one way to push it. Do we push back on the vendors and get them to support things longer? Or do we just fundamentally deal with this stuff as getting commodity and almost disposable? And I don't know what the right answer is. I suspect it's going to vary. So I'll let you respond. Last word if you want it.
Oh, just that this is a great research topic, right? I mean, there's a reason everyone downloads, an Android operating system and works with it because they're free and cheap and quick. But we need computer scientists researching how do you build these things quick, free and cheap and quick that don't bring the same sort of traditional security challenges that an OS does.
So Peter Deutsch from Cal Poly Pomona. I'm going to try to tie together a couple of things I heard yesterday to what I'm hearing today. And you may tell me, God, he was the guy who was doing the marketing stuff yesterday. But so the talk I went to was about science DMZs and how do you secure them and how they differ from traditional network connections with firewalls and deep packet inspection and so on. And as we dug down on that, I'm looking to set up a research backbone on my campus. And as I dug into it and I talked to the cybersecurity guys, and then the professor who wants his students to actually have access to the switches, I ended up with multiple backbones, each seeing the world differently. And that was the thought we explored yesterday. So I propose a name change. It's not the science DMZ, it's the science data DMZ, because what you do with the science data, you can lock it down in some ways and you have to leave it open in other ways. So it's fundamentally sees the world differently. Whereas if you talk about the science experiments that have to be secured, but they're running Windows NT, et cetera. So I don't know if you were there or if this idea has come up in your world, but I'm seeing we're going back to an Internet of Internets model where we have multiple views into the world and we have to treat them differently.
So let me take a whack. So I would say this even if Michael Sinatra was not sitting right over there, right? But so I'm a big...
I'll get paid after, okay.
So I'm a big fan of science DMZs and, agreed, with all of ESNet's doing great things with them. I applaud you for getting that far because I think, selling science DMZs to our cybersecurity professionals can be a little bit tough, but I actually really like the way he put it yesterday because when I do put on a CISO hat and I do that, I'm a big fan of segmentation. That's really what I would, characterize science DMZs are. It's segmenting our network into our different parts of our business mission, right? I mean, you put it well yesterday. We got credit cards over here. We got our enterprise stuff over here. We got our science data. We've got our science instruments. So I'm a big fan of that approach because our policies are so different. And by doing that segmentation, right, it lets us actually do things better on those different network segments from a performance perspective, from a cybersecurity perspective. And so, no, I was very much in line with everything Michael and Eli said yesterday, and very supportive of that. And we do, collaboration around science DMZs and helping to communicate that. So, as you're rolling that out, I know they're supportive. We would also be supportive in helping that, and happy to engage on that front. In fact, we have done engagements. We've got one underway right now with the American Natural History Museum, who's rolling out a science DMZ and working through some of the security issues on that. So I think that's an area we need to get more and better documentation out for all the different stakeholders involved. But I'm terribly supportive of the direction that's going.
Yeah. And to be clear, I haven't sold that on my campus. I've sold the idea of going for an NSF grant, and the details were to be worked out later. My ISO, we've set up a research center. I talked about that in my talk. She still doesn't like the idea that the students could be there after 5 o'clock. So,
You got a culture of problems.
So
Yeah.
there's still a learning curve, It's just a different world, and we have to educate folks, which is I'm looking for more and more people to say that out loud. So.
Well, there's the other thing that doesn't get talked about here, and I understand what you're saying. When the first time I dealt with not a science DMZ, but the problem of a science backbone, we simply couldn't afford to build this was at a large campus, a physical separate network. So we used VRFs to provide a research network. But remember, I'm hoping before I die, we have SDN everywhere. Or maybe before I retire. That's a little more optimistic way to put it. Because SDN may kill me. But the notion that we can have smart networks that are trivial to restructure as needed, it may not help with the really huge, giant bandwidth problem, because that's going to take hardware. But it may help in all these other ways we need to segment networks creatively. Right now, we're still stuck with the VLAN model.
Other questions? Mike? You sure? I better pick in the coworkers, eh? I think we have a response.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Michael Sinatra, ESNet. I wish Mike Korn were here yesterday, because I would have loved to hear his reaction to some of the talks that we gave. And
I've heard you talk before. I'm sure they were fantastic.
Well, but it's not that I want to hear. Really, some of his thoughts, because I've known Mike for a long time, or at least known of him for a long time too, and he's sort of the ideal CISO in terms of the person who's had lots of experience and lots of experience at multiple institutions, leading security stuff, and that includes both the research and the administrative side. My goal is in the conversation to really get segmentation as a real control, and make that sort of a broader topic. I don't really care how people do it, in a way. I mean, it could be VLANs. It could be VLANs with MPLS. It could be EVPN with MPLS. It could be anything. So I'm not too worried about that. But I think it's just important that we get that conversation going and really sort of have the researchers and the security folks, research-aware security folks, and research-aware cyber infrastructure networking folks all in the same room having a similar conversation. Yeah. And now I'm trying to figure out how to turn that into a question. I'll just put a question mark on the end of that and let it go.
But the truth is that this isn't, the problem is you're sort of encapsulating it, and thank you, by the way, that was very kind, is not limited to security. I've worked at places and I've known people that are frustrated because their networking people don't understand research networking and what it means. They're like, well, it goes to the firewall. Firewall has latency. I mean, the reason I got exposed to this early is at a big campus with a big network, we had people running electron microscopes in real time from 200 miles away. They're not going through our net screens. It ain't happening. So you have to get creative, and that's a good learning experience for people. Yeah.
And a question's not necessary if you just want to flatter us.
Yeah, that's great. I'm hoping my boss
Too
is
funny.
watching the live screen.
Oh, there'll be a recording. I'll send to you. Okay. One question?
Sorry, one more follow-on to that. One of the things I'm noticing, because there's a real push on my campus to do collaborative outreach and industry partnerships and things like that. So as I hear all this going on, I'm going, so one of the things, security we think of in terms of somebody trying to do us harm, but it's also about a resource allocation debate and who's allowed to do what. I mean, I have a professor who tried to set up a hackathon, wanted 20 or 30 high schools to be able to come in and attack the VMs he wanted to set up in a student-run data center. But that means going over and poking holes in the firewall and taking up bandwidth and all that other stuff. And so there's a resource allocation piece of this. And you say, okay, if I give you your separate 10 gig link onto campus and the students are running it and you flood it, that's your problem, not mine. So it's the harm part of it is only a piece of the problem. There's the who's allowed to have access, what can you do with it, resource allocation, policy sort of levels of this. And I'm seeing them all actually part of the same conversation, just the neurons you guys are all firing, that's what's going on in my head. So this feeds into other conversations I'm having with other people and who's allowed to book a room, you know? So,
I like
Yes,
that.
yes, management has to be involved.
I'm going to rename our Science DMZ to Not My Problem Network.
yes.
Yeah, I'll manage it. Any other questions? Well, we're going once, we're going twice. All right, I think we're adjourned for the conference. Thank you very much, presenters.